Only mode.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Employer Brand, Rebrand, Refresh, or Tweak. My name is Bob Johnson. I am the practice leader here at the David Group, and I'm happy to facilitate today's session. A couple logistics. If you have any help or difficulty on your dashboard, on your GoToWebinar dashboard, there's a little help icon at the top. Feel free to click on that. I did a practice run of today's webinar, and I completed it in approximately 30 minutes or so, just a little bit more than 30 minutes. So keep that in mind. It's relatively short. We try to structure our webinars to be quick and concise and get you back to your busy days. First, just a little bit about us. We are HR's ad agency. At the David Group, we apply advertising and marketing practices to help organizations attract and retain talent. And for me and my practice group, we're pretty focused. We focus solely on strengthening employer brands, engaging people, and in doing so, we know that we'll help our clients cut the cost of talent. So on to today's webinar, and we have an agenda of 3 items. First, we're going to look at the stages of strengthening your employer brand. And for us today, those stages include, we'll be talking about rebranding, refreshing, and tweaking. And along the way, we're going to talk a little bit about when it's right to consider rebranding, or maybe consider refreshing or tweaking your employer brand. And finally, we'll share a few thoughts in terms of how you can organize your journey or a roadmap onto strengthening your employer brand. So let's jump right into it. So as we begin to talk about strengthening your employer brand, I think it's important to start with defining what an employer brand is, at least from our perspective. And for us, we view an employer brand as a story of you as an employer. But really, it's a story of you as an employer as told by the everyday experiences of your people. And while an employer brand is comprised of many things, we know that among the things that we look at include your employer brand promise, your employer brand attributes, and your employee value proposition. And these are ways in which your employer brand is expressed every day. And we like to think about these things in relation to kind of the life cycle of your employees and the way they interact with your employer brand, starting from awareness of you as an employer, or even as you as a company, all the way through to their experience with you as they go through their career growth and exit and offboarding. And so when we think about the employer brand and employer brand attributes and the promises and your employee value proposition, these are the ways in which those items are expressed. And so I think it helps as we have this discussion to think about, whether that's expressed through your career site or your talent communities, or on your mobile site or your ATS on the attraction side. And on your retention side, how is your employer brand being expressed through your leadership communications or your employee communications, in terms of your onboarding experience, and in terms of such things as even exit interviews and how you relate to the organization once you leave. So these are all moments within an employee's life cycle with you and your company where employer brand matters. And we here at the David Group have a particular point of view as it relates to not only employer brand, but the strength of an employer brand. And our view is that the strongest employer brands truly reflect the authentic story of an organization's employment experience. And when I kind of think about this, and when we kind of sit back and put stuff up on the wall and start, kind of hashing out what that really means, we came up with this kind of notion of an employer brand continuum or an employer brand strength continuum. And that's kind of my background. I came from the consulting world, and all good consultants always think about continuums, right? And so when we think about creating messages and creative design and images and all those ways that we express our employer brands and how we develop those, how we create them, how do we go off and start writing those messages? We kind of start on the left-hand side of the continuum where, it's basically, let's just go with what we think. So we're sitting around the room as talent communicators. We're thinking about, well, what's our employer brand promise? What are our attributes that attract people to join us? What is our employee value proposition, the employment deal that people connect with us through? And we'll just start creating that on our own. But as you go on the continuum, and as you kind of go to the right, you begin to think about, or we begin to think about how we can make that stronger. And that's the way we make it stronger is through validation. We're thinking about using validated employee perspectives. So if you look at this continuum, what we're saying here is that the more you validate your employee perspectives, the stronger your employer brand is going to be. And this is important because the process of validation is a process, and that's going to weigh into how we decide what our next action should be. So for us, validation equals discovery. What does discovery mean? Those are things like focus groups, interviews, which can include stakeholder interviews, employee interviews, leadership interviews, surveys. Surveys are great ways to validate your messaging, your employer brand messaging. Among the things we might look at would include engagement survey data, stay and exit interview data, and any other form of interview or data gathering. And finally, one of the items that we would use as kind of our discovery mechanism would be to do a communications audit. And so as you can see from our process, at least my practices process to approaching it, creating an employer brand, discovery or validation is a key component to the work that we do. And it's a key component to making sure that we are creating employer brands that are strong. So let's talk a little bit about, in terms of definitions, our three categories of strengthening an employer brand. And the first is rebranding. And for us, what this means is it's a comprehensive overhaul of an employer brand. So as we just discussed, this is kind of the full discovery approach. So when we talk about rebranding an employer brand, we're talking about doing as many validation processes as we can. We're thinking about, we have to do some focus groups. We have to do executive interviews. Let's look at the employee engagement data. Let's look at the stay and leave data. And let's put that all into our calculus as we begin to develop the employer brand promise, attributes, and employee value proposition. A rebrand also includes such things as creating an enterprise-wide communication strategy and action plan. If we're going to go through the effort and resources and budget to rebrand an employer brand, we need to make sure that we make it actionable, that we need to activate that brand. This also means, and again, think about that life cycle that we've looked at. It means that we need to create all new materials across all media channels. So everything from your recruitment Facebook page to your career site to onboarding materials to offboarding materials. We want to look and rebrand all those things. That's what a rebrand means to us. And finally, and almost as important as everything that I've talked about so far, rebranding efforts really get directly involved with time to measurable business outcomes. We want to be able to take our new employer brand and not do it just because it feels good, but to do it because we want to drive to certain measurable outcomes, whether that's employee engagement, retention, performance related to recruitment and retention, all those kind of things. But as with any brand manager, and if you think about external brand managers, we are always thinking about measuring to business outcomes. So let's talk a little bit about refresh. We've talked about the rebranding. Another approach, though, to strengthening your employer brand could be thinking about refreshing your employer brand. And in this case, what we think of is kind of rebrand light. And what we're thinking of is targeted and focused interventions. So among the characteristics of what we would call a brand refresh is maybe it's an initiative that's based around trying to deal with one to several issues that you've seen or identified as being problem areas. Typically, a brand refresh is discovery based. So again, at this level of intervention, we're not doing the full-blown discovery or validation process, but we do want to be discovery based, meaning that we're not just going to make decisions based off gut feel. We need to validate the work that we're doing. Refreshing is still tied to measurable outcomes. We still want to make sure that we are putting together branding programs that have true meaning and true effect for the organizations. But in this instance, a brand refresh is really more about kind of updating the brand, but we're not going to mess with or touch or influence the existing branding statements and guidelines. All of this is done within the context of already established branding standards for your employer brand. Finally, for our discussion today, there is a form of tweaking your employer brand, and we actually see this quite a bit. But for us, a tweaking of your employer brand would be essentially adjustments that we want to make to certain brand elements. And some of the attributes or some of the reasons why you may want to think about this or how we define this is, there's spot improvements. They're really kind of limited to passing feedback and common sense. And we'll talk further in the next section about when these different approaches are applicable. But when we say common sense, maybe we've done a full rebranding, it's off and running, but as it's being activated and being rolled out, we see a couple of things that we say, common sense tells us we need to adjust this or adjust that. Certainly within this realm, if we're tweaking an employer brand, we're not altering in any way or changing in any way the existing brand standards. And in these cases, it's really less directed to business outcomes as it is just, again, making a spot improvement. So for this section, there's a couple of key takeaways that I'd share with you at this moment. First is, and we've said this before, and this is something that I say a lot, and I say it to a lot of folks, and that is that employer brand strength is really directly correlated to validated employee experiences. We can't say that enough. The stronger, if you want the strongest employer brand, one of the things you have to do is have validated employee experience. The more you validate, the stronger you are. There's a direct correlation to that. Secondly, and I think an important point to take away from this discussion is not every organization needs full-blown rebranding of their employer brands. In fact, as we kind of travel the country and talk to our clients and friends about branding, there are many instances where we kind of start the conversation with the thought of we have to fully rebrand. And then what we find through our kind of discussions and just kind of thinking it through and kind of road mapping it on the wall, you know, just a little bit of a refresh or tweaking is more applicable. It's an interesting phenomenon when I may meet with people and they see us coming in as an agency. There's almost a trepidation in the sense of, oh, here comes the ad agency, and they're going to want to redo everything. And that's really not the case for us. And so part of our message today in this webinar is there are alternatives, and you can make things better and stronger without having to do the full-blown rebrand. So now let's talk about, spend a few minutes talking about when we might rebrand versus refreshing or tweaking within the context of the definitions that we just described. Before we start this section, there's two guiding principles that I would share with you, and one of which is every organization is different, and every organization is in a different place in terms of their talent communications. Your company is in a different space than my company. So just keep this in mind. There's no absolute rule to this stuff. And related to that, our experience and what we see on a daily basis is that branding is fluid. And again, you know, at some instances, it might be a big project, other instances, it's not. So it's really about thinking about kind of your employer brand promise, attributes, employee value proposition, and how they're connecting with people. And what I often tell my clients and friends is you can always think big, but if we need to, we can start small and we can scale up. Again, it's a very fluid situation. So as I go through instances of when to do either rebranding or refreshing or tweaking, just keep this in mind. It's not all or one of the other. So rebranding. When is it right to do a rebranding? Well, our view is that a rebranding process is most applicable when there's a dramatic change, when a dramatic change is needed. And among the signals that might tell you that a dramatic change is needed in your employer brand might be a couple items, first of which is poor recruitment and retention performance. And we want to be careful here because when I say poor recruitment and retention performance, I'm not talking about, you know, last quarter we had a hard time recruiting a certain position, or gee, we seem to be losing a few people here that we didn't really expect. When we talk about it in this context, we're really thinking about negative or truly adverse performance where it's really affecting your ability to hire the best, it's affecting your ability to keep the best, and you realize that somehow, you know, you're just not connecting, that there's a disconnect between what we stand for as an employer and how we're doing in terms of our talent acquisition and our talent retention programs. So, you know, and it's hard to calculate. Again, every company is different, but I think you'll know it when you feel it in terms of this category. Another instance where we believe that rebranding is essential, and I say essential, is when a company has gone through an external brand rebrand. We believe it's essential to redo your employer brand because there needs to be direct alignment between your external brand and your employer brand. Imagine if we go to the public and we're telling them that we're this type of company, and yet none of our employer branding materials reflect that, or they're old and they're outdated. That will cause not only confusion among either candidates or current employees, it causes an actual disconnect. And that disconnect is such that it causes people to not apply on the attraction side, to not go further in the recruitment funnel or process, to disengage when they're employees, and to leave or leave too early. And it's actually a phenomenon that we're seeing quite a bit, or at least that I'm seeing quite a bit. I've had in the last month or so 2 conversations with uh, two different organizations, both in the corporate sector, both with employee size larger than 7,000 employees, but they've gone through external rebranding, and now they're trying to catch up on the employer branding side because they realize that there's a disconnect in messaging. So it's a very it's a very important thing to think about, particularly if your corporate folks are doing some work on the branding. And finally, at least for today's discussion, we think that rebranding really plays an important role if there's a dramatic shift in mission or culture. I was on a call yesterday with a major employer here in North America, and are undergoing a huge acquisition. You know, an acquisition, they're the acquirer, but they're bringing on, in essence, a huge body of workers, another organization that's similar in size. So you have two organizations coming together, similar in size, and they need to kind of match the cultures. They need to bring them together. And in this instance, while they've done a lot of work in terms of creating their value propositions, creating their employer brand promise and their attributes, they still feel that it's not right and not connecting. And in this instance, since it's such an important moment in their kind of collective corporate history, you know, we're thinking about doing a full rebrand because we want to make sure we get it right. And there's a lot on the line in terms of the retention of the top performers, attraction of new talent to this new organization. So that's an instance where full rebranding is really the path they need to go on. Let's talk a little bit about when to refresh your brand. And so for us, it's when a targeted branding solution is needed. And among the items that we would think about or are signposts to us to indicate that a refresh is more valuable than a rebranding, you know, it's instances where we see targeted talent communication interventions. And specifically if they're needed to solve a specific talent problem. Or in cases of change management, maybe there's a change management initiative that's underway, and in order to change behaviors within the organization, we need to refresh the employer brand to calibrate to the objectives or goals of the change management project. We recently, as an agency, worked with a large healthcare system in which the brand itself was in pretty good shape. They felt the employer brand was pretty well set. They knew who they were. It was validated, but they also knew that they had a problem on the attraction side. Their recruitment marketing messages and their recruitment advertising messages just weren't resonating with the right candidates, and it really was a problem for them. And being in healthcare, excuse me, being in healthcare, that's a particular issue given the challenges that many health systems face with attracting and recruiting very defined segmented audiences, you know, from nursing to practitioners to physicians. And so in this instance, we did go through a branding refresh process whereby we were focused on creating a branding solution around their recruitment messages. And so there was a validation process, as we kind of described in our definition. We went through limited focus groups and limited interviews, but we really crafted a different approach, not changing the core of the employer brand itself, but really making it better to reach a new and different audience. So finally, in this section, let's talk a little bit about when it's right to just tweak an employer brand. And our view is that this is most applicable when, you know, again, everything's kind of been said, it's running well, but we have a need to connect better. We have a need to fix something. And for those of us, like myself, who have been both in talent communications and corporate communications, we know or we've experienced or we've seen or we've made mistakes, but there are always instances of times when we just kind of miscommunicate or we miscue on our communications, or maybe there's times when we need to have some adjustments or reactions to social media. As I mentioned before, maybe we have a great campaign, it's rolling out our employer brand, but we find that once it's out and playing, for example, it's really not playing well on Facebook. So as an illustration, so maybe we want to go back and think about that channel in particular, and what are the attributes or adjustments of our communication that's going to play better on that medium or platform. Sometimes we do some tweaking just because we have this inherent sense that we need something different. And along those lines, we're looking to just connect the dots better between the messages that we're sending out and the messages that we're hoping to get back, or the connections. Remember that communications is not only one way, it's two way, and actually it's always, meaning our new kind of digital communications platforms. So for this section, we have a couple of takeaways for us to consider. And really, this is what it's about. So as we reflect on this section, I hope that you would take away that it's really important to calibrate our desire for something new with need, levels of validation, and the organization's willingness to act. Again, it's funny, as I kind of travel around and get to meet with folks, particularly those in the talent acquisition space or senior leaders of HR, it's always kind of funny because we walk in as an agency and people are like, oh, I'm so glad to see you. Not everybody. Yeah, not everybody's glad to see me, but some are, because their view is, oh, I'm so tired. I'm so sick of what we're putting out there. It is so drab, or it doesn't look good. I just want something fresh. I want something that looks really cool and hip. And that's a natural reaction. We all feel that. We can't walk down the street and see a new design, whether it's on a car or restaurant menu or something. At least for those of us in our realm of the world, we're excited about all types of design. But interesting enough, one of the takeaways that I would share with you is that as much as we embrace that spirit, and it's good for us, we like that, at times we have to kind of temper that, and we have to make sure that we're calibrating that to, are we defining a need? Do we have a level, it's going to require, if we want to go forward, what levels of validation or discovery is it going to require to solve this kind of urge to have something new? And what's our organization's willingness to really act? And that's an important question that we all as practitioners have to take a step back and think about. So we're going to share with you in the next few minutes some of our ideas related to how to get started on your employer brand journey, if indeed this is something you want to do. So for us, there are several kind of elements to think about. And this is really kind of basic stuff, but first starts with organization, or kind of organizing our thoughts. Do I really need to take this journey? We want to think a little bit about assessment. What kind of journey do we need to take? And we want to think about planning. How am I going to take this journey? So in terms of organizing our thoughts related to what we've just talked about, in terms of, do we need to rebrand or refresh or tweak our employer brand? Some of the things or questions that we might be thinking about would be, why am I thinking about this? What's prompting me to think about our employer brand? What am I seeing or hearing that's saying, geez, maybe we should look at this thing? What problems am I thinking about that we have to solve? Is employer brand, or working on our employer brand or making our employer brand stronger, how is that going to solve some of the problems that we're facing right now? On a 5-point scale, how urgent are these challenges? And I say 5-point scale. You may use a 10-point scale, 3-point scale. coming from a background of employee engagement work. I'm kind of a fan of 5-point scale, but in any event, what we're saying here is, can we begin to think as we're organizing our thoughts, can we begin to put a little bit more structure to it, a little more quantification to it? And finally, as you look at this presentation, and I'll send you a copy of this presentation, where do my thoughts fall in terms of the different categories that we've described today? Are my thoughts, are they beginning to organize that it's going to be a bigger deal than I thought it was? Or maybe conversely, hey, maybe we don't need that full-blown rebranding. Maybe we can get by with a refresh or a tweak. So start to organize your thoughts. That's the first path to our roadmap here. The second one is to dig a little bit deeper and start thinking about assessing our real situation. And again, as we've kind of stressed all along today, what level of validation will I need to solve my branding challenges? Because this will give us a window into thinking about how complex the issue is and how much, and here it is, and what's the magnitude or the scope of the contemplated changes to our employer branding. Is this something that we can do in a relatively short order, or is this something that we need to think about and really plan out? And finally, in terms of our assessment, what levels of support I have to accomplish these changes? Are we ready for that? Is our organization ready for this? On one of the companies I had mentioned before who went through the external branding process, the way we're talking to them now about their employer brand really is we're trying to think about ways that we can redo or create their employer brand, but not get into what we would call agency fatigue. So the organization has already gone through an external branding process, and they've been through all the discovery and the building and all that process. So, that's something that you want to think about in terms of what can your organization do and what levels of support would you have to do this type of work on behalf of your company or organization. Finally, planning. As we begin to put a planning together in terms of deciding which course of action we should take on strengthening our employer brand, what business outcomes are we trying to solve or tie to our employer brand initiatives? Do we have a budget? How are we going to measure success? And what will success look like? How will we know if we achieved what we want to achieve? And particularly with the first bullet point, how will we know that we've achieved success beyond the feeling of, gee, I like the way it looks? There has to be a business imperative behind it. And what's the long-term plan or implications? I'll talk about this further in a second in the takeaways, but it's very important for us to always be mindful of what the long-term implications are when it comes to branding. So let's get to the takeaways for this section. First one is, and I think we all know this, we're all professionals, we're all practitioners. Planning helps in every phase, even tweaking. We know that if you have a detailed project plan, if you have an assumption of here's where we're going, here's what we're trying to accomplish, here are the resources that we're going to need, here's our budget, here's our timeline, all those things are critical to success. And part of the takeaway here is those things are even critical for if you're just tweaking. Even if you're sitting there saying, well, we don't really need a lot, we just need to kind of fix something. Our advice is that you still need to plan for that. And also, we are strong advocates in having you think about the notion that short-term fixes feel good. They're always great. But the problem is short-term fixes may lead to further problems and even more complex problems down the road. So we're always mindful to really advocate thinking steps ahead. And this is particularly true within the discipline or practicing of managing brands, and particularly in terms of employer brands. Think about if you do a quick fix related to particular aspects of your employer brand attributes. We are an innovative company, and it turns out that that's really not true. Well, in the short term, you might get more of a certain line of people, but in the long term, you might have issues in relation to um, retention or people who voluntarily leave because they're not connected. The brand promise isn't holding up. So these are things that you want to think about before you just kind of run off and start making fixes to your employer brand. And I'm happy to say, or unhappy to say, that's pretty much our webinar, at least in terms of our content. I want to thank you. Let me check real quick to see if there are any questions in the queue. I don't see any questions in the queue, but I will say this. If you have questions or would like to call me and have follow-up communication, please feel free. We do also have some resources for your consideration. On our website, davidgroup.com, we have a series of white papers and some talent solutions, which are just kind of one-page or two-page summaries. We do have a thing that's called an employer brand dimensions, which is our tool to help that evaluates the strength of an employer brand. But in general, this stuff is on our website. It's free. All you have to do is log on and download. If you have any questions or would like to chat, give me a call or send me an email. Connect with me on LinkedIn and Robert Johnson. And we really do appreciate you spending time with us. You will receive a survey and evaluation, so please, if you don't mind, fill that out and let us know what you think. Let us know if this is valuable for you. And also, let us know if there are any topics you have for the future. We'll talk about anything employer brand or recruitment marketing or anything in our space. I'll talk to you about anything. Finally, I will send you a copy of the presentation along with the link to the recording of this presentation. Feel free to share that with anybody you like. And again, thank you for your time. And I hope that you'll come back to future webinars. Thank you and have a great day.